Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second day. I wish it was the third day already, but we're at the second day. Feels like the third day of the 22nd annual Health Literacy Conference here at IHA. And I just wanted to briefly give you guys some updates before we start the session. So if you're having any technical issues with your as you're navigating around the conference homepage or getting into sessions, just go ahead and go to the virtual help desk, and you can message the technical issues people there or that work at the academium, or you can message us here at the conference at IHA for health.org, and we'll also help you out as well as best we can. So technical issues or any questions that you have going around on the platform, just go ahead and go to the virtual help desk, and we'll figure it out from there. Another thing, just giving you a heads up, is that if you're in a session and you entered questions and ran out of time and the speaker wasn't able to get you those questions, get your questions answered, you can go back to that session, and under discussion and answers, you'll see that your the audience response system is still there, and you can scroll down to your question and you'll see that the speaker might have been able to answer those questions just typing them in. So we do ask the speakers to go in after the session so that they can just directly reply to the questions online. So just so you know, that's there. We're always trying to get your questions answered. And it's important that, we love engagement. And so we want to make sure that you're getting answers to your questions. So with that, I'm just going to start with housekeeping that I totally missed yesterday. I was just like, skip. All right, let's get on to the show, which was kind of good because we had such great content yesterday. But I'll let you guys know today. So if you have questions or anything pops up during the conference, visit that virtual help desk on the homepage. So continuing education, if you're looking for that, also find on the homepage the evaluations link is where you'll find all of the session information and also the session evals and also the overall evals. Also, you can check out the CE information page on the homepage that has just all the information that you'll need. The Scarlett just put everything there for you. The recordings, every session will be recorded and made available within 24 hours, except for this session. This session will only be available live. So you folks that are in today are the special attendees. So hopefully you enjoy. Next slide, please. So during the presentation, you'll be muted, and if you have any questions, you can type them into the chat box for Maria Ross. I'll be moderating for her today, and then also she has different activities where she's asking for your prompts. If you want to type those into the discussion, I'll be monitoring that audience response system so we can make it engaging and as fun as possible. How do you participate? Like I mentioned, questions tab, throw that one in there. There's also a vote button. So if there's a question, if you have a question that you want Maria Ross to answer, just go ahead, type it in the question tab. But if you see somebody else's question, you're like, yeah, that's a good one, and you want to add points to it, it'll move it up in the queue. And the higher up the question is in the queue, the more likely that your question will be answered. So I'll be on the lookout for those high rating question points and just all of them in general. But anyways, I would like to, next slide, please. Finally introduce your keynote speaker that I'm excited to introduce you guys to. So this is Maria Ross. She's a keynote speaker, author, strategist, and empathy advocate who believes in cash flow, creativity, and compassion are not mutually exclusive. She's the founder of Red Slice and advises forward-thinking organizations on how to leverage empathy to better engage and connect. Maria has authored multiple books, including her most recent, The Empathy Edge, and hosts the Empathy Podcast. A dynamic speaker, she has delighted audiences at leading conferences and organizations such as TEDx, the 3% Conference, the New York Times Small Business Summit, and Salesforce, and her insights have appeared in many media outlets, including MSNBC, NPR, Entrepreneur, Forbes, Newsweek, Huntington Post, and the Thrive Global. I'm happy to say that I have worked Maria in the past and I love her. So connect with Maria on Instagram at Slice Maria or on LinkedIn. And I'm going to turn the mic over to you, Maria. Welcome.
I love it. Thank you, Diana. And yeah, please connect with me on Instagram. I love it at Red Slice Maria. That'd be awesome. Welcome to today's presentation, The Empathy Edge, how to strengthen your empathy muscle to boost collaboration and embrace difference. As Diana mentioned, I am your presenter, Maria Ross, and I'm so thrilled to be here because I have a long relationship with IHA, starting from being a patient point of view speaker at past conferences, what seems like eons ago, and then also getting to work with this wonderful team on messaging and branding. So I am thrilled to be here today talking to you all. Let's talk about what's going on in the world for a hot minute, right? There's a lot. We are facing a lot of stresses, a lot of miscommunications, a lot of misunderstandings. Whether you look at a macro level, at racism, misogyny, othering of other people, right? Othering of different groups. We're dealing with a lot of friction and a lot of conflict. And then if we look at it in our everyday lives, there's also a lot of stress and tension, obviously, given what we've been through the last few years, but even before then, around stressful work environments, dealing with, difficult patients, dealing with all the different stresses that are so prevalent in every industry, but especially in healthcare today. And I would submit to you that the root of every problem is a lack of empathy. We are just not seeing and connecting and understanding with each other. We are shouting past each other at all times. And there's a really high cost to that cost of not being willing to see things from someone else's point of view. We remain paralyzed. We don't learn. We end up repeating the same mistakes. And ultimately, we don't connect and engage, whether it's with our teams, whether it's with our colleagues, whether it's with our patients. And the macro problem with that from an organizational level is that we degrade our brand reputation, our team's productivity, our patients' experience, and the organization's overall performance. But there's obviously hope, or I wouldn't have been invited to speak to you here today. And so I just want to give you a landscape of the journey we're going to go on. So today we're going to talk about what empathy means in a business context, how you can make it real for yourself on an everyday basis. I want to share with you just three, even though there's many and there's more outlined in my book, three benefits of empathy to your team and to yourself as a leader. I want to quickly talk about avoiding the empathy veneer as an organization, as a team. And then I'm going to share with you three ways to strengthen your own empathy. These are habits and practices you can put into action today, tomorrow, and continue to practice them because they might feel uncomfortable for some of you at first. For some of you, they may not. If your empathy muscle is really strong already, you're probably doing a lot of these things, but if it's atrophied a little bit, if stress has gotten to you and burnout, these are great reminders of how to reconnect with your empathy so that you can have more productive conversations with people. And then overall, I just want to inspire you today to redefine success and foster more unity. So I want to share with you my personal story of empathy. It's my patient story. And in 2008, I was unexpectedly struck down with a ruptured brain aneurysm. It caused a subarachnoid hemorrhage. And a lot of fortunate accidents happened that enabled me to get to the hospital immediately. My husband actually came home from work early that day, even though he normally doesn't, because I wasn't feeling well that day. And luckily, he was there when I collapsed and was able to call 911. And we were living in Seattle at the time. So we happened to live near I think it was one of the highest level trauma centers in the region. We lived about 5 minutes away from it. So I'm gonna shorten this story. I wrote a book about it called Rebooting My Brain, if you're interested, but 6 weeks in the hospital, various procedures and surgeries, lots of post-acute rehab. And this is a picture of me walking with my brother in the hospital. And what you can't see here is that I actually couldn't see at the time I was in the hospital because my rupture was so severe, it caused rupturing in my retinas. It caused blood in the retinas. So it was a very hard journey. It was a very long journey. But through the experience at the University of Washington Medical Center, the care I received was extraordinary. And at every step in the process, I felt heard, I felt respected. I felt listened to. Everything from just silly rules like you got to choose what to eat every day from the menu, or there were no structured visiting hours and people could be with me whenever I really needed them. All kinds of different rules. After I was able to sort of get on my feet again, I decided to become a patient advocate for University of Washington, and I got a peek behind the scenes and realized that I wasn't just lucky enough to get a lot of nice people on my care team. It was empathy by design. It was operationalized empathy. And many of you are familiar with patient and family-centered care, which is a philosophy of the University of Washington Medical Center. So I was able to peek under the covers and see that every experience that I had was a result of intentional decisions, intentional training, intentional communication. And it opened my eyes to the fact that we can create empathy at scale. It's not just about hiring a bunch of really nice people. It's about creating an organization and a culture and a structure and processes and rewards that enable people to default to an empathetic outcome. And that experience helped me heal. That experience helped me recover. And I know empathy in your own organizations can help your patients recover as well. So as a business strategist, when I got back to my business and I started working again, I realized that there was real power in this idea of organizational empathy and helping leaders. And I say the term leaders, but I mean everyone. Everyone's really a leader within their own sphere of influence, helping them understand the extraordinary power of empathy to achieve radical success. And whether success is defined as your own career or a collaborative team or fantastic patient outcomes, it's really an opportunity to leverage this very human skill and bring it to the business world. So I want to do a quick exercise with all of you. And this is about seeing what we expect to see and understanding how aware we are. So I'm going to show you a picture, and I'm just going to give you 20 seconds to write down everything or to note how many blue objects you see. Okay? I'm only going to give you 20 seconds. So are you ready? I should have put a timer on. You're just going to have to trust me. Okay. So I want you to tell me, if you can, in the chat or in the discussion, and Diana will read out answers to me, how many orange things you saw. And I know I just threw you a curveball.
I'm still waiting for those to
I'm
come.
wondering if anyone actually did notice how many orange items there were in the picture, or what your reactions are to me asking that curveball question.
Let me check the discussion tab, see if they've come in. Oh, so, oh, shoot. 11, 13, 14, 15, 12, 20, 13.
Was that actually orange items, or what I initially asked you, which was for blue items?
Oh, they're just listing numbers.
Okay, so they must be listing the blue numbers, yes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So
that's just a fun little twist to remind us that what we focus on, we see, and then we ignore what we're not focused on. So that's a really important thing, because we see what we want to see in other people, in their opinions, in what they're saying. We just default to the area that we're focusing on, and that can be positive or that can be negative. And so this is just a way to understand that preconceived notions prevent us from seeing other things. They prevent us from seeing potential and value within our teams, within diverse populations, within understanding that other people have something to say and something to contribute. And that gets in the way of effective communication and ultimately access to care. When we hold those preconceived notions, whether consciously or unconsciously, it can interrupt our ability to deliver the best possible care experience to people. So let's talk about what is empathy, especially in a business context. But before we do, I want to have what I'm calling talk triggers. So these are where you're going to enter some information into the discussion. I would love to know what negative or positive beliefs you hold about exhibiting empathy at work or as a leader if you lead a team. If you could share some of those in the discussion, and Diana can co-host with me and let me know what's coming up because I don't have visibility.
Yeah, so I'll let you know when those come in.
Yeah, I know there's a little bit of a delay. So, anything that when you think of being empathetic at work, whether you're a leader or as a colleague, what negative thoughts come to mind about that? Like caveats, and what positive beliefs come to mind about that?
So I'm still waiting for some of those. Yeah, I'm making sure to keep refreshing my screen, but I'm reading some of the ones from that orange and blue activity.
Are they cursing me? Yeah.
They're so funny. They're like, I can remember just one orange thing, but maybe it was red orange. No
It's
orange,
so
but
true.
I was definitely just looking for blue.
Yeah, the first time someone did this exercise to me, I was annoyed because I'm a perfectionist. And I was like, but you didn't ask me that.
So some answers are coming in. It says,
Great.
different from how I shared other places, that it's a soft skill or less value. Makes for a more familiar workplace. Empathy gives space for us to support and grace to each other. Help people better relate to you. Feels too vulnerable for the workplace. Empathy equals weakness. It lets you get taken advantage of. Isaac says it's positive, helps gain trust from the community. Joanne said, I believe it's important in both roles, but worry about being taken advantage of by some. Yeah, empathy can be seen as a trait that is negative. It's emotional. I get the one who says, in my enterprise, I always practiced and favor empathy as a leader. This really helped my team perform at a whole different level. It's important for growth and support. Somebody said, well, said it's negative, it's too soft. No experience, scared to hold people accountable. It's positive or people-oriented, caring, and adaptable. Someone said, you can't be empathetic and hold colleagues accountable.
Ooh, I've got news for you. Whoever put that.
Someone said it's easier to connect with people. Isaac said it's negative. The community thinks your empathy is fake. That's interesting.
Ooh, that's interesting.
Yeah. Genuinely empathetic.
These are great answers. I love all of this. This is like, it's as if I seeded these folks to guide the rest of the conversation. And I just want to point, this is really funny because I wrote The Empathy Edge a few years ago. And by the way, all of you on this call are getting a copy of that book, thanks to Diana and Michael. And I'll remind you of that at the end. But I'm actually working on my second book because now I'm hearing that exactly this, like, how can I remain an empathetic colleague or leader and still expect excellence, set boundaries, and avoid burnout? That's actually now that the converts are on board, these are some of the struggles they're having with, showing empathy or practicing empathy at work. Any other nuggets we want to point out, Diana, or can I move on? Similar vein.
Yeah, similar vein. Yeah, we have to learn to balance. I don't see it as a weakness. Yeah.
Awesome.
Similar vein, yeah.
Great. So let's talk about different definitions of empathy, because when I spent 3 years researching The Empathy Edge, that book, and every expert I talked to had a slightly different definition of empathy. And even the dictionary definition of empathy has changed over time. Back in the 1800s and the 1700s, it meant something. The word sympathy actually meant what we more today consider empathy. So it's just like all languages evolve as cultures evolve. And also as we've learned more about the brain and emotions, the definition of empathy has changed. And there were some experts out there that I really was drawn to how they defined empathy. Former President Barack Obama defined it as seeing the world through the eyes of those who are different from us. And the leadership expert, Simon Sinek, talks about it as actually the most important tool in a leader's toolbox. It's the ability to recognize and share other people's feelings. So for the purpose of this conversation today, and for the purpose of all my work, I really want to invite you to look at this definition of empathy. It's being willing, able, and to see, understand, and where appropriate, feel another person's perspective. And further, use that information to act compassionately. So I think of it more as information gathering, as understanding someone's context. You will notice nothing in here says it's about being weak. None of this talks about being a pushover. None of this talks about just doing what other people want, right? It is a method of an information gathering. And that often makes people in a work context breathe a sigh of relief that, oh, I thought it was crying on the floor with my colleagues. Not always, right? It can lead to that. And if you have that kind of relationship with your colleagues, great. But it doesn't mean you have to if you're trying to be an empathetic leader. So I think it's important to talk about what empathy is not. It is not being nice. You can be really nice and bake delicious cookies and bring them to work every day. But that doesn't mean that you see and understand my point of view, does it? So the mistake people make is equating nice with empathetic. It's also not caving into crazy demands. As I just talked about, it's a way of trying to understand where someone is coming from. You are still responsible for making tough decisions. You are still responsible for holding people accountable. The way that you do it can be empathetic in terms of being able to see, hear, and value other people. One of my most empathetic bosses in my career was someone who laid off the entire marketing team. Did I want him to do that? No. But the way that he did it, he was thoughtful in how he communicated it. He had thought through before he even told any of us what our questions and concerns might be. He saw our point of view. He let us vent. He let us ask questions, and he provided support after we had to leave in terms of references, leads, connections, all the things. So the action he took didn't seem very empathetic. It was a tough business decision. I have to lay people off. A lot of organizations are dealing with this right now. But the way that some of them are doing it right now, I would class as not empathetic at all, right? You can make that tough business decision, but because you're understanding another person's point of view, you're taking their feelings and perspective into account. How do they feel? What might they need? What questions would they ask? And then finally, and this is another big sigh of relief, empathy does not mean you agree with someone. You can be empathetic and have a conversation and try to understand someone's context and why they think what they think, especially let's say if you're having a debate over a strategic initiative or how to go about doing something at work. You can listen to each other and understand that you have different ways of approaching the same problem. It doesn't mean you have to walk away as a convert to what that person is talking about. It just means you have a better understanding for where they're coming from, why they think what they think, and then maybe that can help you both find a way forward, maybe find a third path that you didn't think of before. I love bringing up in this discussion the name Edwin Rutsch. He is a gentleman who runs an organization called the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy. And he does training, free training for people all over the world on a facilitation technique known as empathy circles. And I describe it, I went through it, and I describe it as a painful exercise in active listening, where you are just listening and reflecting back to someone what they are saying without judgment or offering your own opinion. And he has done these empathy circles at the most divisive political rallies that our country has seen over the last few years. And he's been able to get people from opposite sides of the political spectrum into a tent to have a conversation without screaming at each other and to give each other a hug at the end and not walk away changing their political ideologies, but at least seeing each other as human beings and connecting on that level. So just because you're nice doesn't mean you're empathetic. It just means you're nice. Just because you cave into crazy demands, it doesn't mean you're empathetic. That's submission or acquiescence. And just because you agree with someone, it doesn't mean you're empathetic. It means you don't have the internal fortitude to hold your ground and keep your values, right? So these things are not empathy. And that's where we get the reputations and the false narratives around the fact that empathy is weak. Empathy means you're a pushover. Empathy is too soft. You actually have to be amazingly strong inside to be a truly empathetic leader, because you have to be self-confident enough and aligned with your values enough to be able to take on someone else's point of view without feeling threatened or without getting angry. That takes strength, my friends. That is not weakness. To be able to make space in your brain and know, hey, I don't know all the answers. There might be another way at looking at this problem. So there's actually two kinds of empathy, and we're talking about the brain and the heart, right? Cognitive empathy is where you imagine, you understand what they might be thinking and their perspective. You're using your head to go, how would I feel in that situation? Or, wow, that must be really hard, right? Luckily, thankfully, I've never been a refugee of a war, but I can imagine what that might be like. I can identify with fear and hopelessness from different things in my life. I can imagine what it might be like. Then there's emotional empathy or affective empathy. That's where you're literally feeling the feelings. You're sharing the feelings. You're building that emotional connection. Cognitive empathy can often lead to emotional empathy, but it doesn't have to. And again, it's the emotional empathy that people think of when they think of empathy, and they think things like someone said earlier, that it's too emotional to bring to work. Both of these types of empathy can lead to compassion. Compassion is actually empathy in action. And that's when you're moved to act. And being moved to act doesn't mean doing what the person wants. It means I communicate in a certain way. It means I am prepared to answer questions in a certain way. Think of the example I just gave you of the boss that had to lay off the entire marketing team. He still laid off the entire marketing team. He didn't change his action, but he acted in other ways that were empathetic and that showed compassion because he understood what people were going through. So now that you know sort of these different elements of empathy, cognitive, emotional, and compassionate, I'd love if you put in the discussion, what do you think you need to be aware of when engaging in each of those different types of empathy? Cognitive, using your head and imagining; emotional, actually feeling the feelings and getting that emotional connection, and sometimes getting caught up in those feelings; and then compassionate empathy, when you're actually taking an action. What are some things you might need to be aware of, or some things that you might want to look out for when you're engaging in any of those aspects of empathy?
Okay, so we're waiting for some of those, that little delay, but
No
someone
worries.
asked, where can they get more information about empathy circles?
Oh, I will have the URL. I have it in a slide at the end. You can also do a search for empathy circles, Edwin, EDWIN, and you can sign up for one of his training cohorts. It's kind of a big time commitment, but it is a transformational experience, especially if you, not especially, but particularly if you think you already are an active listener. You may find that you're not as much of an active listener as you think. And I'm raising my hand on that, because it was, like I said, it was like isolating your active listening muscle. Are we getting some answers in?
Yeah, we also have a couple of questions if you want to take some of
Yeah.
those.
Let's focus on the talk trigger first, and then maybe we can take a question or two before we move on.
Okay, sounds good.
Because we might get to some of your questions that you have, I think, within the presentation.
You need to be aware of choosing words carefully, listening
Yes.
and observing the person on the other side.
Mm.
Boundaries.
Yes, boundaries are so important, especially with emotional empathy, so you don't lose yourself in someone else's emotions and issues.
Um, maybe nonverbal cues.
Mm-hmm.
You'd want to know your own point of view as well as the other person's, your tone,
Yes.
cultural, political, religious preferences.
Yes. Can I just pause on that one for a second? Because I think that's one of the things that's hard. We want to encourage people to engage in cognitive empathy, but we also want to avoid assumptions. or biases, because we're still using our own brain to imagine that person's situation, which means it's within the lens of our own experience, right? So even if we're trying to use cognitive empathy and we feel like we still can't understand that person, that's where conversation and connection need to take place. So it's very important to engage in cognitive empathy, but recognize that there are drawbacks to that in terms of biases or your own frame of reference. So I always talk about, or in the book, I talked about the platinum rule. So we talk about the golden rule, right? Like, well, these problems will all go away if you just do unto others as you would have done unto you. That's actually not empathetic. What is empathetic is the platinum rule, which is do unto others as they would have done unto them, right? They are not us. We are not them. What are some other ones, Diana?
Protecting myself from not feeling too much.
Yes. Yes, that's a good one. That's especially if your empathic skill is really, really strong. If the force is strong with you in terms of empathy, that can be really hard to not, and especially in healthcare. I've spoken to lots of first responders on my podcast, on the Empathy Edge podcast. And that's a big thing I always probe with them is how do you separate connecting with the person in this very difficult moment and, having the presence of mind so you can act, right? I had brain surgery. I don't want my brain surgeon to be so emotionally connected to me while he's performing surgery that his emotion is clouding his judgment, right? But he can be empathetic with me when we're meeting outside of the surgery and I'm consulting with him and we're having our visits and our scans and our advice sessions. So there are times when you do have to compartmentalize that. And then let's take one more.
One more. It's a lot of pressure. So many
Oh,
good
sorry.
ones in here.
Well, just shout out a few more.
Okay. I'm getting a lot of boundaries and active listening. Emotional people aren't their emotions, but pivot when they feel threatened. It may be helpful to get people to name the emotion they are feeling and why.
Ooh, I love that. Yes. No, and understanding your own self-awareness is actually the key to empathy because you need to understand your own triggers.
Another one we said emotional boundary, but also physical boundaries, asking before doing. So example, can I hug you? Can I hold your hand? Can I touch you?
Yes. So true. So true. Really great. Okay. I want to read you this quote. Daniel Goleman is a leadership expert and one of the godfathers of emotional intelligence. And he has this quote. It's not really a quote. It's sort of a philosophy of his. Understanding our own emotions is only half of the work in a conversation. Learning how to constructively understand and respond, compassion, acting, to the emotions of others is also critical to our effectiveness working with them. So it's not only understanding their point of view and their emotions, but that's why self-awareness and self-care is so important. I need to understand what's going on inside of me, how I'm reacting, what is coloring my judgment in this interaction. So let's talk about how empathy benefits you and your organization. We're just going to talk about 3. There are many more listed in the book. But number 1, it spurs innovation and good health outcomes. So I want to tell you about a little company called Google. And they did a big study many years ago to try to understand the secret sauce of the teams that created their most profitable and innovative products. And this is a company that was founded on the premise that you couldn't innovate unless you went to a certain school, had a certain skill set. They used to screen people at the very beginning of their company for those factors. And they did this study and they proved themselves wrong because what they found out is across all of their products, the most innovative and profitable ones came from not necessarily the A teams at Google that had all the right, criteria and credentials on paper, but it came from the teams that were high in collaboration, empathy, and communication. And my premise, my supposition about this is that if you have a team that's actually listening to each other and they're respecting other points of view, they can actually come up with more ideas and they also can get things done because they can work together. So they were actually able to deliver those products to market. and get them into the hands of consumers, versus a group of people that all think they're the smartest person in the room and are all fearing sharing their ideas for fear of competition, or someone might take my idea or steal my idea. They were able to allow innovation and creativity to flow and communicate better with each other. And that's why they were able to deliver. And there's a study from NIH that shows that physicians with higher empathy experience less stress, cynicism, and burnout. And I think this is because they're truly defining empathy in the way that we've defined it here today, not in the, I'm just going to give everybody all of me and have nothing left for myself, but really about empathy in terms of how they deal with colleagues, how they deal with patients. They tend to, because they're able to create those collaborative relationships and take that time to build those connections, they experience less stress, cynicism, and burnout. And finally, there's another study that talked about the patients reported better outcomes when they perceived their physicians or their care teams as empathetic. And I think that that's important, just from almost like a placebo effect of, if I feel seen, heard, and valued, I'm going to feel better about myself. I'm going to listen to discharge instructions more carefully. I'm going to follow up with my visits to the doctor and my prevention and wellness checks. If I feel like I'm visiting someone who really sees my point of view and understands me. And I just want to talk about this from the perspective of an empathetic leader. For those of you who may or may not know, Satya Nadella is the CEO of Microsoft. He took over many years ago from Steve Ballmer, who was one of the original people at Microsoft. And his whole leadership philosophy is based on empathy. And he infused this philosophy into the culture at Microsoft, which was a horrible culture. My husband worked there for many years and it almost killed him, literally. He worked there under the Ballmer regime. And Satya comes in, he makes sweeping changes to make the culture more empathetic, to foster more collaboration, and he triples the stock price in just over 4 years. And he directly attributes this to a culture change. And he talks about the fact that our most innate ability is to put ourselves in other people's shoes and see the world they see it. Sometimes life beats that out of us, but we are born with it. Science proves that we are born as a species, it's how we've survived, is because we are empathetic and collaborative. He said empathy is at the heart of design thinking. So when we're talking about innovation or new ideas or doing things differently, it's because of empathy. Empathy enables us to do that, to see things from the user or the patient or the customer point of view. It's why University of Washington Medical Center even has a position called a patient advocate, a patient advisor, which is what I was, because they wanted to hear from people who'd actually been at the hospital and actually had their care there, to say, what is it like? What questions do you have? What things would have made the experience better? And so Satya goes on to say, when we say innovation is all about meeting unmet, unarticulated needs of the marketplace, it's ultimately the unmet and unarticulated needs of people. So we have to connect on that human level. Second benefit, empathy boosts engagement and collaboration. Empathetic cultures experience higher retention, morale, productivity, and innovation. And work is changing, right? And this was before the pandemic too. There are no more lifers. If there are, they're very few in many industries. And modern workplace challenges demand that, because of the problems that we face in 21st century medicine, business, society, you can't solve these problems alone. We have to work in groups to solve these problems. And empathy enables those groups to work more effectively together. And so we can overcome workplace and industry challenges with more innovation and with more creativity and more engagement if we're working well together. I just want to show you this slide of what happens when leaders are empathetic, right? There was a study by Catalyst, and it was an exhaustive study where they interviewed people that defined their leaders as empathetic and those who defined their leaders as not empathetic. And the differences in attitudes are startling. So 61% versus 13% of employees were more likely to be innovative with an empathetic leader. 50% versus 70%, 17% said their workplace was more inclusive if they had an empathetic leader. 76% versus 32% were more engaged, and 86% versus 60% were able to navigate the demands of their work and life successfully. I call this work-life integration because there is no such thing as work-life balance, right? Work-life integration. And just, from from the selfish motive archives, empathy in the workplace is positively related to job performance. So there's no better way to get your manager to rate you as a higher performer than if they think that you're being empathetic with your team and you're being effectively empathetic with your team, not letting standards slip, not, chaos, but managers who practice empathetic leadership toward direct reports are viewed as better performers in their job by their bosses. And then managers rated as empathetic by their subordinates are rated as higher performing by their own boss. But please remember, because I've spent a while now talking to many leaders, doing leadership trainings for different groups, that it's not all just about leaders showing empathy to their teams. Empathy is a two-way street. So it's not that team members and workers get to sit back and enjoy the empathy from their leaders. They have to practice empathy towards their leaders and their colleagues as well. It's not all just about me. It's about the team. And I want people to see my point of view, but that means I need to be able to see other people's points of view as well. And I think that's a really important point to understand that it doesn't just roll downhill. It needs to flow in two directions. And finally, a big third benefit of empathy is that it drives performance and profits. Empathetic companies are aligned with what their customers need, and they can reap financial success. And physician empathy, there are some studies on this you may have seen, can actually decrease liability risk because physicians that are rated as more empathetic tend to have less malpractice claims against them than their peers. So it not only is a wonderful thing to facilitate better health outcomes, it actually saves the organization and physicians, caregivers personally, money from avoiding malpractice risk. And with the philosophy of patient and family-centered care that I mentioned earlier, which is a worldwide philosophy, they get outcomes such as lower readmissions, better health outcomes, and efficient resource allocation, all which impacts the bottom line. So I always like to say that empathy is not just good for us, it's not just good for society, it's good for business too. And I want to make a note on this because someone mentioned the thinking it's fake about empathy. How you avoid the empathy veneer is that you are consistent and you walk your talk. So when we look at an organizational level or a team level, we can't just say we're empathetic. We can't just have a bullet point on a slide or on a poster that says we're an empathetic organization. What does that actually look like in practice? What are the policies or the hiring practices or the rewards or protocols that exist to foster empathy from the inside out? What are we doing at the individual and leadership level? Are we hiring people and looking for emotional intelligence and empathy? Are we training and supporting people to remain empathetic but set boundaries and still achieve high performance? What are we doing for individuals? Because empathy is a human trait. It's got to start with the people, right? And then what's the environment we're putting them in? What is that team and culture like that fosters and operationalizes empathy, like I talked about before? And then finally, now I can make a promise to customers or patients or to the external market that we are an empathetic organization because we're living it from the inside out. And you could look at this at a very micro level at yourself. Instead of just going around saying you're empathetic or talking about how important empathy is or that it's a culture or a value that you subscribe to, what are you doing to walk that talk? So I can take some other questions if they're off topic, but I also wanted to offer out another talk trigger is how you think empathy relates to diversity, inclusion, and belonging, and how it might relate, and or whatever question you want to answer, how does it relate to health literacy and health equity? And again, we can take any other questions that have popped up as well.
Yeah. So many discussion. I have to scroll all the way back up to the questions. So the first question I have here is does bias get in the way of leaders being able to exercise empathy? If so, how do you help leaders move beyond their biases to connect?
That's a great question. And that's where when I work sort of from a strategic advisory perspective, I advise organizations that are trying to make empathy training a part of their curriculum, a part of their leadership development curriculum, to also reach out to inclusion and bias experts who can train on how to recognize and factor in bias into decision making and into relationships. That's not a path I go down in these trainings, but number one, it definitely impacts empathy, because if your bias is so strong that you have a certain assumption about another group, or worse, don't even realize you have that assumption about a certain group, it can get in the way of you truly being able to understand them and actively listen and understand the context of the decisions that they're making or the feelings that they're having. So it kind of gets back to that first step of self-awareness in exploring what conscious and unconscious biases you may have, and exploring how to temper those so that you can be ready to actively listen and take on other points of view. But it definitely is a problem, especially in terms of cognitive empathy. Great question.
Some of the questions are coming in,
Okay. Are the
comments.
answers to this? Okay, great.
Yeah. It relates to retention and job satisfaction. It promotes best care by enhancing DEI.
Mm-hmm.
I think empathy helps us be more open to bringing in staff who are different from us.
Yes.
Empathy is key to understanding in any communication. Blending that with biases can lead to things like diagnostic overshadowing is important.
Yes, absolutely. And I have spoken to a lot of DEI experts, as I mentioned on the podcast, as well as through my research. And we often talk about the fact that empathy is the fuel that makes DEIB efforts and initiatives even work, right? Because you could tick a box and you could hire diverse people and, make sure you have underrepresented groups throughout your organization. But if they don't stay because they don't feel seen, heard, and valued once they're there, then you're blowing up your DEIB efforts. So what's required is empathy, so that once we're all in the organization together, we're not just a bunch of different people who are sitting around a table misunderstanding each other. Empathy is the fuel, the grease that greases the wheels. I use a lot of analogies, by the way, and some of them are mixed metaphors. It's the fuel that greases the wheels so that those initiatives take hold, so that you actually can build a culture of inclusion where everyone's voice is heard, where you can get different points of view and uncover and discover opportunities you never would have if you didn't look at a problem the way other people might look at a problem, right? If we're constantly hiring people who look and act like us and think like us, we get a very narrow view of how to overcome challenges. But if we're able to have empathy and set aside ego, because empathy requires us to set aside ego, and understand that there are different ways of looking at the same challenge, and there's different ways of looking at the same problem, and you're open to them, then you actually get the benefits that DEIB promises to organizations. Is there any around how it relates to health literacy and health equity?
Yeah, absolutely. One said you can't have health equity without empathy. Someone said, what we know about health literacy and health equity is that it's not one size fits all. For information to be impactful and actionable, we have to be relatable to our audience and be empathetic to what's important to them and what actions are in their capability.
I love that. That is worded so articulately, because it is about, I can put all the communications and trainings and protocols out there that I think are the right way to do something. If they're not being received, then that's on me to understand how I can make this better received, how I can ensure better adherence, how I can ensure that patients have a good experience.
Someone said, I'm loving this talk. Just
yay.
Empathy and equity. I think that empathy leads us to ask the right questions, consider our audiences in a more
Ooh,
thoughtful way, and so we can direct our efforts toward root causes like social determinants of health. So,
yes. I love that. I had a woman on my podcast who is an expert in functional medicine. And we talked about the fact that empathy is at the root, pardon the pun, but empathy is at the root of being able to do effective root cause analysis. And that most of our time should be spent in asking questions and trying to determine the root cause than in the prescription of the solution. And I just thought that was so insightful of like flipping that, because we always are running to the solution, right? We're running to what we think is the right thing or what that person needs or what we're assuming that person needs, instead of taking that time, which actually leads to a better, it might take more time, but it leads to a better outcome in the end. So I find it to be more efficient. But I love that. Empathy leads us to ask the right questions. Thank you, whoever said that. Maybe one or
so
two more.
yeah, somebody said empathy correlates to cultural humility. And next tomorrow we have some sessions on that too. So it's
I love
everything's all
that.
tied together. Yeah.
I love it. I would love to recommend a book. It was, again, another person I had on my podcast. This is why I do my podcast, is so I can meet interesting people and hear about and learn from them. There's a gentleman named Embr Kaissi, Kaissi. He wrote a book called Humbitious, which is about the marriage of humility and ambition and how that's the magic combination. That's the peanut butter and jelly of making you an effective leader. And it's actually, it can be hard for some people, right? Because they're brought up in this very outdated model of leadership, where leadership is command and control, and I have to know all the answers or pretend I know all the answers, right? But humility enables you to hear other points of view and maybe get a better idea and a better solution than you would have had on your own. And ultimately that reflects well on you as a leader. So why not do it, right? Because if your team ends up
Right.
performing, then you can get ahead. Was there more, Diana, you wanted to share?
There's one about jargon. People won't feel included if we're not listening carefully to what they are saying and feeling. We need to be open to others, to other not having the same vocabulary. We do examples like jargon.
Okay, thank you so much, because as part of my role as a patient advisor at UW, I did talks to clinicians about health literacy. And I would tell them, look, I'm a college graduate. My husband's a college graduate. We're both white collar professionals. And we don't know what you're talking about in the hospital. We're not brain injury experts. Like, we're in a different environment. And so making assumptions about, like, for a long time, I didn't know what PCP meant. I was like, isn't that a drug? I don't know what that means. You all know it's primary care physician, but if we don't live and eat and breathe in that world, it doesn't mean we're dumb. It means that's just not our world. And I could talk about marketing and advertising and branding to you, and you may not know what the heck I'm talking about, right? So we have to have a recognition that, especially in healthcare, people are thrown into an industry unexpectedly that they didn't have time to cram for that test, right? They didn't have years of study, and they also are not part of the everyday culture. So thank you, whoever brought up the jargon issue, because that is such an important thing when it comes to health literacy of, and, you know, I, as a patient, became bold enough to interrupt my doctors and my nurses and say, I don't understand that term you just used. Most people will not do that. And then that's where they get the discharge instructions wrong. They get the dosage instructions wrong. They get all of these things wrong that, again, lead to negative outcomes. So thank you. Do you want to, is there one more good one in there? One more juicy one?
Well, just to tag on to that, just to
Mm-hmm.
so that people know I'm reading their comments.
Yeah,
Someone had said that there's essentially like a bias. When if you're a physician, you have naturally a high literacy. Well, not naturally, but you have the ability to have a high literacy level, and so
totally.
sometimes they don't take consideration that maybe that somebody else doesn't have that same ability when they're talking. It's just
Right.
an
Right.
like an unconscious bias,
Right.
probably.
And it's not about dumbing it down for people, you know, and like talking to them louder, like they're, you know, but it's about, you can use the jargon and say, do you know what that means? Let me explain that to you if you don't. I have an older brother who's been a lawyer for decades. And he falls into this trap all the time when he's talking about cases or legal stuff. And he uses terms that he thinks we all understand, but because he's our brother, we can go, what are you talking about? So I love this. Yeah, it's so tightly related because it's about, again, going back to, it's not about being nice. It's not about caving in. It's not about agreeing. It's just about seeing things from someone else's point of view and going, that's good information. I'm going to use that information to now take a next action, whether that's explaining a term or connecting with them or asking them if I can hold their hand, whatever it is. So here are 3 ways you can strengthen your empathy as a leader. And I share these, again, there's more in the book that you'll be getting, but these are sort of the go-to ones of trying to practice this every day. And I equate the art of strengthening your empathy muscle to going to the gym. First of all, it's a muscle we're all born with. And maybe because of family upbringing or work environments or life, it has atrophied. So we can all use some practice. Now, you don't go to the gym and the first day expect that you are going to have 6-pack abs, do you? You have to work at it. It might feel weird. It might feel awkward. You might make mistakes. You might pull a muscle. You might be sore the next day. It doesn't mean you stop practicing. You keep practicing until it becomes just part of how you interact with people. And then you'll find you don't have to think of it as much. You don't have to focus on reminding yourself about it as much. So the 3 we're going to talk about, and I'm going to go into detail on each of these, is practicing presence, be curious and actively listen, and find common ground. So the first one, practice presence, is really all about what I talked about earlier, which is self-awareness, but very particularly making sure you're in the moment and grounding yourself first so you can make space for another person's point of view. If you are focused on the next meeting, your to-do list, I'm running from here to there, I don't leave any space between my meetings so I can settle and ground myself before the next discussion or before the next meeting, you are doing yourself a disservice. You're being less effective. You think you're being more effective by cramming more into your day, but you're really not. So you've got to ground yourself so that you are on stable ground. As I mentioned earlier, you are strong enough to be able to take on and hear another person's point of view without defensiveness or fear. And when your foundation is solid, you're able to do that. So what does it mean to practice presence? It means I'm here in the moment. I'm not multitasking. I'm not on my phone, texting while I'm talking to you. If I'm in a meeting, I'm focused on the person speaking. If I'm in a contentious discussion or a difficult discussion, I am making sure that my head is clear and I am present and having the conversation so that I can read the cues from the other person, so that I can ask questions, so that I can take that time to pause. Now, some of you may have a mindfulness practice, but mindfulness experts say even just 5 to 10 minutes a day is enough to sort of ground yourself. You don't need to go spend 8 days at an ashram in India to develop a mindfulness practice. So maybe just throw some ideas in chat. How do you start your day? What rituals do you do before a high stakes meeting or discussion, or just, again, before your day starts? And if you don't do anything, I want you to look at some of the ideas that come across in the discussion and pick one thing you can start tomorrow. And if you want something super easy, do some breath work. Deep breath in for 4, hold for 4, breathe out for 8. Do that 10 times before you have your cup of coffee in the morning and see how it changes your day. But do it every day and give yourself at least 3 weeks to develop the habit before you write it off, right? So what are some ideas we're getting, Diana, in the discussion on how people start their day to sort of ground themselves, or what they do before a big meeting or a big presentation or a tough discussion they might have to have with a patient?
Yeah, I'll let you know as soon as they come in. But I have this interesting comment about the empathy, health literacy, and AI. So with the
Yes.
recent developments in AI, it'll be even more important to have the basic human traits of compassion and empathy, and using these in combination with health literacy to be a better healthcare provider.
I love that. I actually wrote about the fact that, you know, people were thinking for a while there, people before the pandemic, people were thinking empathy wasn't important because the machines are all taking over anyway, right? It's AI, it's machine learning. But actually, in a world where we are going to have more things that are automated, the very human trait of empathy is what is going to be our advantage, because those are the things that can't be replicated. 100%. That human emotional and that human connection, we can't replicate that. And so that's going to be an advantage to you in your career and an advantage to you in your organization, the more that you can develop that muscle.
As we're getting in some of the
Rituals or
yeah,
mindfulness. Yeah. What are some things that people do to give those that don't some ideas?
you're right. I sit and recenter myself in the moment and put it in perspective of the big picture called life.
Love it.
I like to spend some time with myself over a walk and a cup of coffee.
Love that.
Have a cup of coffee while sitting quietly. I pray and read scripture.
Mm-hmm.
Start each morning with a walk around the neighborhood.
Nice. Does anyone knit for presence or mindfulness? Because that's one I hear a lot as well.
I haven't seen knitting or
Knitting. And for some people, it's working out. It doesn't have to be something still. It could be just whatever puts you in the moment. It could be, for me, most mornings, it's like a workout. It's a Peloton ride, or because then I'm completely focused on the thing I'm doing. And I try not to think about all the other, the hamster running on the wheel in my mind.
Yeah, someone agrees with Ellen says a solid workout makes me feel sharp and less sluggish, so I can focus on what I need to do.
Yeah.
Heart math. Aaron says heart math is evidence-based and a wonderful practice.
Ooh, what is heart math? It was heart, like Heart?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. I need to find out more. I'm going to look that up on Google.
Yeah, right.
But it could be, I love the easy things, right? For me, I don't check email I try not to, before I actually sit down to work. I get my son ready for school in the morning. I take him to school, I shower, I work out, and then I sit down to work. And that's when I check email for the first time. Because otherwise I'll get caught up in that. I won't get anything done for the whole day. I also like to sit and have my breakfast without a screen in front of me.
An easy one that I think is doable, right? It's 10 minutes of simple stretching.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
That's a great one. So for those of you who don't have a practice, these are some ideas. Taking a walk, sitting in silence with a warm beverage in the morning, just gathering your thoughts, setting an intention. For some of you, it is things like yoga or meditation. There's great apps. I highly recommend the Calm app. Every day they do a daily meditation that's no longer than 10 minutes. I admit I don't do it every day, but for people that can be more disciplined about that, it's a great like mini way to get yourself into doing something. And just FYI, some of our most successful leaders in the world, like the Richard Bransons, I can't think of anyone else right now, but they talk about the fact that they have a morning ritual. They have a mindfulness practice that they do every morning. And again, practice. It might be hard at first, but it's worth it. Another
yes. Sorry, we got a yes on the crocheting and the knitting. Just
yay. Okay, cool.
Okay.
My record's unbroken. This is another gem from Daniel Goleman. It's if your emotional abilities aren't in hand, if you don't have self-awareness, if you are not able to manage your distressing emotions, if you can't have empathy and have effective relationships, then no matter how smart you are, and I would add, or how many degrees you have, you're not going to get very far. So that's something really important to remember. So before I give you the second one, how would you respond? You're on a call with a colleague, and he candidly shares, I'm feeling unsettled these days. Especially during the pandemic, this was a popular conversation. So how do you respond to that? Put your answers in the discussion.
All right, Maria, you're going heavy.
I am. What's your next question?
I want another question. Okay.
Or what is your response? Maybe this is a person that doesn't often personally tell you how they're feeling, so it's even more awkward.
Do you want me to give you
Yes.
yes. Let me see if any have come in. Oh man. Mary and Ryan, you said tell me more about that. Mary and Ryan, if you want to tell me what you want to know more about, I'll be happy to pass that on to Maria for you. I have to call this one out just because I'm also a new mom. Someone said, I'm a new mom, so I'm figuring out how to juggle motherhood and my career. I don't have a morning routine, but I have mastered a nighttime routine for my son. It's a
Nice.
lifesaver. Yeah.
Love that.
Okay. Some people have said some questions that they say is say more. Oh, that's what Maria, sorry, Marion. Marion Ryan said, tell me more about that in response to your question.
Is what she would say to this colleague. Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Tell me more. Tell me what's going on. I say, me too. What are you doing for yourself? Ask what's going on. Do you want to talk about that? If you feel comfortable, do you want to talk about it? I'm sorry. What are you feeling unsettled about? Is there something you like to spend time on? How so?
Okay, these are all amazing because I just want to tell you. So, what is it? It's 2023, right? It's May 2023. When I started promoting the book in the fall of 2019, and by the way, that was before the pandemic, the responses I got were very different. So, and again, totally well intentioned. But what most people would say is, I'm feeling really unsettled too. This happened to me the other day. Da, da, da. I can totally relate to what you're feeling. And all of a sudden, the conversation was about them, not the other person. And I call that empathy hijacking. So be aware of it, because I have done it in the past too with every good intention. I have done it with the intention of relating to someone and making them feel less alone, when really what they need is just to be seen and heard, right? And there might come a time in the conversation where you can ask for consent. You can say, I think I know what you're going through because I went through something similar. Would you like to hear about that? Or would you like to just keep talking to me about how you're feeling? So there's a way to be relatable. I talk about this often in the context of when I was recovering from my brain injury. Very well-intentioned people would tell me, they would ask me how I was doing, and I would say, well, I'm struggling with vocabulary. I'm struggling with, short-term memory. I can't remember anything from 1 minute to the next. I can't, get up off the couch. I don't know what's going on. And they would say, oh, that happens to me too. I have to write everything down. You're just getting older. That's all that is. Or, I feel the same way. I'm fatigued all the time too. I think that's just because we're getting older. They're doing it with the best of intentions to make you feel not alone. But then I felt like my experience was minimized when people did that to me. And so that's why I call it empathy hijacking, because I really do believe that and again, I've done it. We really do believe we're being empathetic, but we're not giving space. And so I love that 4 years later, this conversation has turned. And there's actually a book by a wonderful guy named Rob Volpe, who's a friend of mine. He wrote a book called Tell Me More About That. Or Tell Me More. I can't remember what the exact title is, about empathy and some pillars of empathetic conversations, which is a great book you might want to check out. But yeah, it's about giving people space to be heard and letting them talk and feel seen. And then, asking for permission if you have something to offer. Because one thing I've learned from leaders that I'm interviewing for my next book is that, one of the things they do is when their team members come to them and want to talk, right? And they're either complaining or they're venting, whatever, is they ask the question, just so we're on the same page, is this something you just want to speak about? Or is this something you want me to help you solve? And it sets the table of like, no, I just need to vent. Cool, go ahead. No, I need you to help me solve this. I need you to help me act on it. Then it's very clear which way the leader has to respond. So number 2 of the practices is be curious and actively listen. Did you know that curiosity is the number 1 trait of empathic people? And it's because They don't guess at your context and your point of view because they ask you about it. They ask you about your life, how you're feeling. What was that like? Tell me more, right? Tell me more, the 3 magic words, especially, this is a little tip, when you're having a contentious or difficult conversation. Instead of rushing to defend your point of view and why the other person is wrong and you're right, try to make your default to be to let them get everything out. Tell me more. And then they will talk and then probe deeper on that. Tell me more about that. That's a facilitation technique I use in workshops that I run, where people are disagreeing with each other across the table. And I might think what I heard is the craziest thing in the world, but I want to understand what's behind it, right? There's always something behind what people are saying. If someone's saying, I don't agree with that budget plan, I think it's ridiculous, instead of going, no, it's not, and here's why, tell me more. Why do you think that? What are you seeing that I'm not seeing in that budget plan? And then you can affirm. This is where the active listening, the empathy circles comes in, right? So what I hear you saying, make sure you heard them right. This is how you can minimize bias, is you might be hearing them through the lens of your own bias, but make sure you heard exactly what they said. And this is what is so interesting, because you have to do that without discernment, no matter what the other person has said. So what I'm hearing, Diana, is that you think the sky is purple and that it rains coins from the sky. And that, am I hearing you right? Like, no matter how ridiculous I might think that is, that person needs to be heard. And we can't have a conversation if I'm reflecting back something that they didn't say, right? And then as you have the conversation, you can enrich. I want you to try to get yes, but out of your vocabulary. Because has anyone here ever taken improv or studied improv? Yes, and keeps the scene going. It keeps the conversation going. Yes, but shuts down a scene and makes it really awkward for both actors because they don't know where to go. So practice a little improv in your conversations by enriching the conversation. And that leads me to habit number 3, is find common ground. Think of Edwin Rutsch in those tents at the political rallies. How can you connect with people that have polar opposite viewpoints from you? Those viewpoints help make better decisions, especially if it's among colleagues or among team members. So focus on where you both agree, however small, right? And it could be ridiculous for you to state it out loud, but let's say you're having a disagreement with a colleague over a budget decision or over a strategic decision. Look, I think we can both agree that we want to keep the clinic running. We don't want to lose our jobs. Like, I know that's not what we're talking about, but can we both agree that we're on the same side of the table about that fact, that you're just approaching the problem differently than I'm approaching the problem? But where is it that we can both agree? Where can we both state the shared goal and keep coming back to the shared goal, whether it's with a difficult patient, right? Where do we agree? We both agree that we want you to be discharged from the hospital in, 2 weeks, right? That's what you want. That's what I want. Here's how we can try to get there together. But that puts you from butting heads this way to actually being on the same side of the table, even if, like I said, it's the most obvious or ridiculous thing that you share in common. As I mentioned, discern, don't judge, assume good intent. They're just looking at the issue differently than you are. And this is where yes and comes into great power. It's hearing what they have to say and how they might go about taking a next step or solving a problem. Yes, and how about this? And you enrich the idea and then continue to check in with each other. So if this is something, let's say this is something over a long strategic planning process internally, it might take 6 months, right? It might take 3 months. Make sure you're continually checking in with each other and revisiting that shared goal so that you're constantly putting yourselves on the same side of the table. So in order to start your workout, you need to know what muscles need toning, right? And these are some resources, and you'll get these slides in a PDF form, so you don't have to frantically write down these URLs, but there's an EQ quiz and the Toronto Empathy Questionnaire. You can either just look those up on Google, or you can go to psychology-tools.com/empathy, empathy-quotient. And then you can also go to that same URL.com/Toronto/empathy-questionnaire. Harvard offers a free implicit association test for unconscious bias that any of you that brought up the issue of bias being a challenge to empathy, this is a great way to see where you are. Clifton Strengths Finders, I'm not sure how many of you have done that. I've done that in the past. It's game-changing. And it measures your strengths to understand not only where you are strong, but you can also have a discussion about the shadow side of all of those strengths and where, too much of that strength can go too far. And if you want to do a free assessment, there's a leadership coach named Brandon Miller with a company called 34strong.com. And if you email him at brandon@34strong.com, tell him you heard about the Clifton Strengths Finder from me at this talk, and you'd like to take a free version of it, he's happy. He's trying to get this into as many people's hands as possible. It's not an obligation to coach with him. He just really wants people to understand their strengths. And then I mentioned the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy earlier. There's lots of references there and self-assessments you can take. And then finally, HEARTY, which is an acronym, there's a strength quotient, a leadership assessment at heartyquotient.com that will help you understand where you are on these different strengths. By the way, the E stands for empathy as one of the 21st century required leadership strengths and collaboration strengths. So you can see where you fall. But it's really good to take that pre-check with yourself of where you are and where you might want to adjust or build or tone those muscles. So everyone take a deep breath. This is my son from a couple of years ago. That was a lot of information packed into a short period of time. But I hope you take it in. I hope you take a breath. I hope you take a breath before every meeting that you have at the start of every day, because that pause is so important to being able to open yourself up to empathy and to know that it doesn't matter where you are on the spectrum. It is a muscle that you as a human are blessed to have. And if you don't feel, if your excuse is always, well, I'm just not a really good, naturally empathetic person, or I'm not touchy-feely. This is not about being touchy-feely. It's about being able to connect with people and gather information so that you can have collaborative and productive discussions with people that lead to positive outcomes. That's really what this is all about. I'm going to leave you with this quote from Tim Cook, who's the CEO of Apple. He is not weak. He is not soft. He is not a pushover. There will be times when your resolve to serve humanity will be tested. Be prepared. People will try to convince you that you should keep your empathy out of your career. Don't accept this false premise. These are outdated leadership models that say that leaders can't emotionally connect with their teams, that they can't be human, that they can't be vulnerable. Those are not the models that are going to help you succeed in your career or for your patients or your colleagues in the future. And that's not even a maybe, that's a definite. Those models are dying. And we want to embrace these newer models of human connection to enable us to achieve radical success. So I want to invite you to think about, what type of leader or colleague will you be? What will be your legacy? What do you want it to be? Do you want people to talk about you as the most toxic leader they've ever worked for in their lives and how miserable you were every day when they went to work? Or do you want them to talk about you as someone who made amazing connections with people and got stuff done and was able to achieve goals without burning bridges, but by creating connections? What do you want your legacy to be when you retire? So with that, I will take any last minute questions we didn't get a chance to get to, Diana. And this is my Oprah moment. Everyone gets a book. You get a book. You get a book. Thanks to Diana and to Michael and all of the team at IAHA. You will all get a digital copy of The Empathy Edge, and I hope you will check it out and read it and reread it. And if you have any questions or comments that didn't get answered in this session, or even later after you read the book, please reach out to me. And I continue the conversations with experts. You will love them on the Empathy Edge podcast. So you can download episodes on a podcast player or at theempathyedge.com. The content's free and it's really valuable to your career and your life. So Diana, do we have any last minute questions we want to get to? Because we've got time. Got 10 minutes.
Absolutely. Molly wrote in, I hope you can comment on how empathy is gendered and impacts of that phenomena. It's a skill socially expected for women, but less so for men, and not to say that men are incapable. I wonder what professional outcomes this leads to and how the layer of gender, how the layer of gender might lead to gender inequities in the workplace.
Such a good question. And ironically, I just spoke to a podcast guest yesterday. I just recorded an episode about that very question. It's a woman named Carol Vallone Mitchell, and she wrote 2 books. The most recent book she wrote is called The Collaboration Code. And it's about how traditionally feminine leadership traits are actually what's going to help men succeed in the future of work as well. And so this was the whole conversation that we had, because initially when I interviewed Carol a few years ago for the book, she talked about the fact that there really was no clear-cut study. You could sort of find whatever study you wanted about whether women were more naturally empathetic than men or not to support your point of view. She has since, and she's done a lot of research through the pandemic, she has since learned that there are biological differences in terms of hormones, oxytocin, things that enable us to connect that are more prevalent in women. But it doesn't mean all women are good at empathy. As a matter of fact, 2 of my most psychologically abusive bosses I ever had were both women. And second, she said that men can show empathy if they are willing to embrace those more traditionally feminine traits. And all of that feminine, masculine traits, they're not laws of physics. They're societal expectations that were foisted on us that said that women are more collaborative, men are more authoritarian. We're human beings. Nobody said it had to be that way. So if people get hung up on I'm a man trying to be a leader, so I have to act this way, they are going to come to learn, as I mentioned before, that those leadership models are changing and that actually adopting more traditionally, quote unquote, feminine traits in your leadership style is a better pathway to success, especially in the new era of work we're in, where those expectations are set by the new talent coming into the workplace. They expect leaders to act with empathy. They expect leaders to act with collaboration, and they won't go work for people that don't have that leadership style. So that leadership style is dying out, but men in the workplace, according to when I spoke to her yesterday, she said these successful C-level men that she's talking to that have adopted this type of collaborative leadership do get pushback. And that goes back to my point I made earlier, where you have to be really strong to be able to embrace empathy. And they are just dealing with the pushback because they know the benefits they get from continuing to lead in that way.
Wow, it's interesting. It sounds like we're making our own challenges by the social constructs that
we absolutely are. It's all socialization.
Someone says, the last question I think is wonderful. Dare I say that your medical experience would not be the same for a brown or Black person? How can we get medical professionals to recognize that they need to be empathetic across skin colors?
Absolutely, I 100% agree. And it makes me very, very, very angry. I follow a lot of activists working on health equity for people of color. And I think by helping people, number one, understand that empathy is a superpower and it's not weak and it's not soft, that it's required especially in healthcare, if you want to be successful, if you want to have successful outcomes. Number two, I think people need to reflect and investigate their own biases, even if they proclaim they don't have them. And that's why some of those resources that I gave are so important. And number three, I think it is about what we just talked about. It's about adopting these different leadership styles so that we are understanding that different people have different needs. And if we are not equitably listening, it's more about the equitable listening to people that is really where I think the crux of the problem is. And anyone can disagree with me. They may think they're not showing bias, but because their default is to not equitably listen and take in and put ego aside and be able to hear the experience of the person in front of them, regardless of color, that's what's causing this issue, is that Black and brown people are not believed, they're minimized, they're put in the back of the line when it comes to prioritization and triage. All of these things is because they're not empathetically listening and understanding that if I'm not listening, it's because I have a bias and I need to check myself on that, or I need someone else to check me on that. So I wish I had the magical cure for that, but I think it comes down to more white leaders putting their ego aside, understanding that whether they know it or not, they have biases, because that's what the data show us, right? This is not subjective. The data show us that these are the outcomes. And if there's data there, they need to believe that and understand that they might or might not be part of the problem. So I think it's that recognition, and it's that humility that we need to come back to again and again, and getting better at being able to actively listen and recognize our triggers and our biases so that we can put them aside when a human being who is suffering is standing in front of us.
Absolutely. I think I'm hearing a lot of like, it's just a humanistic approach. And I think a lot of that stuff also applies to our LGBTQ plus community as well.
Absolutely. I follow and have on my podcast many activists in that space too. And the horror stories of the medical care they've received. And I really don't think those clinicians or doctors or nurses are evil people. They just don't realize what they're doing and the impact that they're having on people, because they're not educating themselves. They're not making themselves aware of the issues in those marginalized communities, and they're not listening. They're not listening. So, this is where what we said earlier about the getting defensive. The minute you're getting defensive when someone shares their experience with you, that's a sign that you're not being empathetic and that you're not actively listening, because you should be able to take on that point of view and recognize that there's truth to it.
I think will be our last question, and I think it touches on the point of when you were talking about before about constantly coming to the same goal, or that finding that common ground. And what Brian writes is, I had a fellow white colleague try to engage me in a conversation that is anti-Black, especially during the protests of 2020. They think that I'm going to agree with them as another white person, yet I firmly disagree with them. I was on the side of the protesters. How do you manage a situation like that, where I frankly have zero empathy for their viewpoint, and I don't think it's healthy for me to spend some time affirming their anxiety/racism?
I love this. What was the name of the person that said this?
Brian DeGreer.
Brian, I love this question, because this is something I am struggling with every day. And I wish I had a better answer for you as a student, as a student of empathy. I often don't think of myself as an empathy expert, but as an empathy student and curator. And I really struggle with that, because sometimes people hold a point of view that is not just a point of view. It actually goes against my values of humanity, right? So it's very hard to have those conversations. There have been people that have written work about this and about getting past those things that have now become politicized, right? And those issues where the politicization of it has gotten in the way of us connecting as human beings. But I I don't have a clear answer for you except to try to listen. But if listening is too painful, then, I know it is for me sometimes. Sometimes I do need to walk away, and I can only educate so much. I can only share resources so much with people. But if perhaps this is a person maybe that you have to work with, it sounds like, maybe you realize that is an area where you won't agree, and you can focus on the areas where you can collaborate and can get things done with each other in the context of your work. It doesn't mean you have to be friends with that person. It doesn't mean you have to condone their point of view or change your point of view. But especially in the workplace, about that particular issue, you might have to put that aside and focus on where you do agree and where you do align when it comes to the work at hand. That's the best advice I can give from someone who struggles with that all the time myself. And I will continue to share resources and share experts on the podcast for people like us who can shed some light on how we can address that. Another great book to recommend, and someone who was on the podcast, and I'm sorry I'm talking about the podcast so much. You don't have to listen. It's just my frame of reference for all the information I've been getting, was a woman named Monica Guzman, and she wrote a book called I Never Saw It That Way, or something like that is the title of the book. But if you look up Monica Guzman, she has written a book talking about her experiences dealing with her parents, and also other people, about how we can get past these very, very, very divisive issues and still connect with empathy with each other in other spheres and in other realms. And so I think that might be a really helpful book.
All right, Maria, I think unfortunately the party's over.
It is. Sorry, we went over.
No, it was a wonderful talk, and I think that this is so amazing in so many ways that I think we've moved from the beginning to the end in just this 1 hour. We've all changed, I think, our perspective in a lot of ways about empathy and what we think about empathy.
Yay.
And I think also there's some questions coming in about the book. So we have you as an attendee, and we'll reach out to you via email to let you know how you guys can access the book. And it'll be a link that you can click directly to access the ebook.
Thank you so much, everyone, for all your engagement and your questions. And if I didn't answer anything or not to your satisfaction, please shoot me an email or connect with me on Instagram.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.